little background here. Right now, the world is facing a situation where we find that the American-dominated unipolar system, which has really colored the global order since the end of the Cold War, is gradually giving way to a multipolar system, with China being far and away the preeminent rising power. Historically, rising powers and ruling powers have frequently, not always, but frequently, come into conflict with one another. There are several models that predict conflict on this basis, but as we'll see later in the presentation, these models are of dubious applicability in the modern age, particularly with the nuclear calculus on the table here. Now, not only can the modern world not afford a great power war, but myriad global challenges threaten the security of the world in general, and these challenges require concerted collaboration. Now, in a great power dynamic without real historic precedent, what are the basic guidelines that the United States should follow to productively manage its relationship with the primary rising power in China? All right, so what we're going to be doing here is we're going to look at four general areas of concern. We're going to look at the U.S.-Chinese balance of power in very cursory terms. We're going to look at economics and military balance of power, both conventional and nuclear. In addition to that, we're also going to take a look at some of the predictive theoretical models that I mentioned earlier. We're also going to discuss allies and how alliances affect the bilateral Sino-American relationship, which, with the impact allies have, really kind of makes the idea of a bilateral relationship just go right out the window. And finally, we're going to look at some areas where there are some shared opportunities for cooperation. Now, instead of proposing solutions at the very end, what I'm going to do is at the end of each section, I'm going to propose solutions at that point that, as it's applicable to those sections, so that we don't get lost in the weeds. In overall balance of power terms, the United States is still on top. However, China's catching up in some pretty significant ways. In 2014, China surpassed the United States as the largest GDP in terms of purchasing power parity in the world. Their economy is about $1 trillion larger than ours being roughly 17 trillion, theirs being roughly 18. Now, it is important to note that these economies are heavily dependent upon trade between them. The U.S. and Chinese economies are very interdependent. Now, we also have a great geographic military advantage. We are protected on two sides by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. To our north, we have one border, and it is with our closest ally in Canada. To our south, we have Mexico, who offers us absolutely no military threat whatsoever. China, on the other hand, they live in a pretty rough neighborhood. China shares borders with 13 countries, 4 of which are armed with nuclear weapons. 2 of those are of pretty questionable stability in North Korea and Pakistan. Just off of the eastern and southern Chinese seaboard are powers with very strong American military alliances in Japan and Taiwan, respectively. Also, Japan and South Korea house considerable American troops and military iron. According to the CIA global firepower and other sources listed at the end of this presentation that you'll see, the United States outspends China in terms of defense spending roughly 5-1. We have an enormous lead in sustainable power projection weapons, specifically aircraft carriers and submarines. The United States operates 19 aircraft carriers, China operates 1. We've got several decades of experience using aircraft carriers. Flight ops at sea is very, very complicated science. China's still learning this. They've only had an operational carrier for about 3 years. So, submarines, we have roughly the same amount of submarines the U.S. and China does, but American submarines are primarily nuclear powered. where China submarines, they have less than 10 that are nuclear powered. They're still using diesel powered submarines. Why that matters is that has everything to do with sustained deployability and the combat radius. Now, the nuclear power balance isn't really so much of a balance. The United States has far and away more weapons than China. They've got about 4% the weapons that we have. The United States has kind of abandoned a MAD theory. That was the Cold War theory of mutually assured destruction. We started building ballistic missile interceptor shields, and that takes away the retaliatory strike option if these function. What China's doing is now they're starting to MIRV their warheads. That means they're putting multiple re-entry vehicles inside, so with one missile, you effectively can turn one missile into several different warheads. A lot of bang for your buck there with MIRVs. Also, China's working on hypersonic boost glide weapons that would be able to defeat interceptor shields. The United States is also developing these, so we don't really have a strategic balance in our nuclear weapons posture with China, and that's pretty dangerous. So the recommendations, knowing what we know about the balance of power, we're going to want to lean on shared interests in trade, so as to remind ourselves and the Chinese that it's very much in our interest to maintain the peace. We're also going to want to use the significant military cushion that we have to allow us to be both calm but remain prudent in policy. We're also going to want to keep China's regional challenges in mind as we respond to their military buildup. Certainly we want to reach a strategic balance with China in our nuclear posture so as to avoid nuclear modernization. Okay, so on the theories, we're going to stick to the one that offers the most dire prediction about the U.S.-China relationship, and that's John Mearsheimer's offensive realism, which is a very controversial theory, but it's also quite popular in China, so it does merit some consideration here. Its four basic tenets hold that states operate in a self-help system, all states have some offensive capability, the future intentions of states are unknowable, and finally, that survival is a state's highest goal. It also holds that the best way for a state to achieve that highest goal is to become a regional hegemon and then to ensure that they have no peer competitors in that regard. This theory holds that enmity between the United States and China is assured because the United States is a regional hegemon that will in turn work to prevent China from becoming a peer competitor in that regard, and that China will seek regional hegemony in its area of the world and then seek to undermine American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And those two competing goals will simply come into friction. And the proof of this theory, at least according to the theory's primary proponent and I guess you'd say the father of the theory, John Mearsheimer, is there were four cases in the 20th century where the United States, after it had secured hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, came up against peer competitors, or at least potential peer competitors, those being Imperial Germany, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and the Soviet Union. The United States, of course, engaged three of them in direct war and was instrumental in what John Mearsheimer calls putting all of them on the scrap heap of history, this being because the United States does not tolerate peer competitors. Now, this theory, it's got its critics. Kevin Rudd being one of them, he holds that the theory's central tenet of the unknowable future intentions of states really undermines the conclusion that states will seek security via hegemony. If we know they're going to seek security via hegemony, then we can't really say that their future intentions are unknowable. We already know that one, at least. So the theory says so. There's some logical disconnect there, and I myself criticized the theory on the idea that the United States was not the aggressor against any of those peer competitors, though we did ultimately end up placing them on the scrap heap of history. That wasn't the motivation for engaging them. All right, so because time is really running short here, We're going to limit exploration of predictive models to offensive realism and make recommendation in response to it. And that recommendation is that American policymakers be mindful of this theory because it is popular among Chinese policy circles, but also to be very critical of such fatalistic theories and to avoid crafting policies which leave us in Beijing with limited policy options in keeping with that fatalism. All right, so a quick discussion of how American alliances affect the Sino-American dynamic. We've got the four major points we're going to touch on. First is that these allies do contribute greatly to American security. Now, the means by which they do that is not so much that we rely on their weaponry for our protection, but rather the space that they afford us to house our weaponry, to keep logistics storehouses, things of that nature. It's kind of like asking a buddy if you can park your car there, but in this case we're asking if we can park a squadron of F-22s. Now, as you can see on the map here, our alliances provide us with a considerable reach globally. Now, as the balance of power starts to shift somewhat in the East Asian region, it's expected that some allies may turn to a rising China. Now, this may be the case with the Philippines right now. In October, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte very publicly announced that he wanted to move his country's foreign policy away from the United States toward a closer relationship with China. Referring back to the map, you can see we lose quite a bit of operational space in the South China Sea if we lost the metaphorical Philippine lily pad. Now, also, the interests of allies can end up creating tensions in the bilateral Sino-American relationship. That can create a situation where allies are less likely to address their issues directly with China and seek resolution, preferring instead to simply hide behind the American security guarantee. That can really exacerbate tensions between the United States and China, and that's something that has to be watched very closely. The United States cannot allow itself to be dragged into a major power war over something like Scarborough Shoal or the Diaoyu Islands. Now, here's where it can get a little tricky. Although we don't want the interests of our allies to drag us into conflict, if our allies start to feel that the security guarantee that we're providing them is lacking, if they sense a weakness in the American resolve to protect their interests, then they may break from the alliance completely. And in that case, it wouldn't be completely out of the realm of reason for them to start pursuing their own nuclear deterrence. If they lose protection under the American security umbrella, then seeking their own nuclear deterrent is not an irrational move for them to make, but it is certainly something that is not in the interests of either the United States, China, or regional stability as a whole. All right, so in terms of some very basic recommendations of dealing with the American allies, we want robust diplomacy that clearly defines American breakpoints and encourages allied negotiations with China where feasible. We want to maintain our advantage in allies, but account for the possibility that some could indeed defect to the Chinese orbit. All right, so finally, let's look at some areas of mutual concern and some opportunities for cooperation here. Obviously, global climate change and consequent human migration that's anticipated from that matter, both to the United States and China, infectious disease and growing power of non-state actors in terrorism, obviously a key concern for both powers. Global market stability matters everything to the top two economies in the world, and non-proliferation. All right, so recommendations in this regard. We want to encourage China to act as a responsible stakeholder by providing recognition of the great power status that China seeks. We want to tie that recognized status to their contributive effort and the degree therein. That's covered in a lot more detail in the paper. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and thanks again, and wish you a wonderful holiday.